Hi, everybody. I'm Yael. Thank you for inviting me. I'm here to tell the story of my mother, Zikrona Livracha. Um, First of all, I said thank you for inviting me, and I would also like to thank Machon Shem Olam, which is an institution in Kfar Haroeh, Israel, that it's also a Holocaust remembrance institution. They train guides to Poland, to take people on tours, and they also train second generation to tell the story of their parents. So I did a workshop there and they helped me put together my mother's story. So I just want to mention them. Um, you see here two pictures of myself and my mother. Her name was Giselle or Gita Cycowicz. Um, she was larger than life. Um, she was just a person with so much drive to live and joy and activity. And she passed away. Her yard site is coming up soon on Rosh Chodesh Elul. It's going to be 2 years. She died at the age of 97, and she was active really almost until the end. She went to Poland with youth groups, probably close to 100 times. Um, you know, um, I, hi. What I want to do today, okay, I'm here to tell her story. I would like to tell it from my perspective. In other words, if I would just tell the story, you could see a movie. There's a lot of stuff on the internet about her, and you're welcome to look it all up afterwards. But I would like to connect to her story from my perspective. And I like to look at the human side of it. In other words, there's the geography and the history of, and there are millions and millions of stories, but this is the story of a particular person and a particular family. And I'd like to look at the human side of it, the evil, the goodness, the human spirit, solidarity, the daily survival, the humanity. And I'll start just by saying what it was for me. Um, I don't know, you guys are all, I guess, late teens and 20s. Is that correct? 20s and up? Okay. So I think when I was your age or older, I realized that I was born only 16 years after World War II. I grew up in a home in America that was comfortable. My parents had parnassa and we had culture and we had comfort and we had friends and we had security. And um, it's such a short period of time, 16 years. Maybe you don't realize how little 16 years is yet. When you'll be a little older, you'll realize how little it is. But it was shocking to me because it was so far away from me. And I knew that there was something, that my mother went to camp and it wasn't the kind of camp we went to. Um, and I grew up kind of with my fingers in my ears. Now, she's going to tell those stories again, and I didn't want to hear them. So I knew it existed and I knew she had an accent. So I knew it existed before I really understood what it was. And it was only many years later, when she said to me, after she came to Israel and she started telling her story, and she said, "You never really heard my story." And when I heard it from start to finish, the way she was telling it, there was nothing that I didn't know. I had heard it all already. Um, I even remember, I just want to share with you as a teenager, thinking, when that's the age where you think your parents don't understand you and, they don't understand your life. And I remember thinking, like, oh, well, when my mother was my age, she was in Auschwitz. So how could she understand me? And it wasn't like, oh my God, my mother was in Auschwitz at my age. Poor mom. Like, no, it was just, she can't understand me. That's the teenager. Okay. Um, When she invited me many times to join her on her trips to Poland, my sister went with her, my brother went with her, my cousin went with her, and I just always had an excuse and I never really wanted to go. And then at one point I went, yeah, I went with her twice. And I started to be the one actually who collected her story, even though I mean it's available, many, many different recordings and but I kind of started to internalize it and it became mine also. Um so I'll start I'll tell you that you know what I'll just show you a few pictures. Okay. Again, these are pictures of how do we go down? One second. Mm, Oh, I know. Yeah, here we go. Okay, so I'll go through a few pictures and then I'll tell the story. This is a picture. Um, in recent years, they Yad Vashem opened. If there's anything that I say that you're not familiar with or something, you could stop me and ask questions. First of all, please. Yad Vashem opened a branch in a place called Ir Habahadim. It's a huge military campus in the Negev, where they train soldiers. And they've always been taking soldiers as part of their training to Yad Vashem. And they said, we're going to open a branch over there, first of all, so they don't have to travel from all over the country to Yerushalayim. And we could also set it up in a way that's geared toward the things that we want to teach them in particular. And I have a cousin who works at Yad Vashem, and she was the director of putting together this place. And at the opening, my mother came and she spoke as a representative of the survivors. And when you walk in, there's this wall. You could see that wall. You can't see many of the pictures, but you see that they're all colorful. They're actually all black and white photos with a colored light behind them. And they look very alive. And they're pictures of everyday life. You see a family on a bicycle and you see, all kinds of like everyday things. And as soon as my mother walked in there, she saw this picture of her father. She has only one picture of her father. And she has it at home and she knows the picture because it was sitting on her, in a very prominent place in the house, but it was small. And here it was enlarged and it was at her height. And her reaction was just to stroke his face. And that's what she's doing here. Okay. As I said, she had this immense drive for life. You see her in the shuk, you see her in the desert, you see her walking to a restaurant, walking on the beach with her grandchildren, telling her story to anyone willing to listen. The upper left picture that you see her in Poland, I think it's an amazing picture. Everybody's looking at something that nobody sees. She's pointing, and like the focus of the picture is actually outside the picture. But you see how she's telling the picture there in Auschwitz. The bottom left picture is a meeting that she had with President Biden around 3 or 4 years ago. He came to Yad Vashem and he asked to meet with two Holocaust survivors, and he met with my mother and another survivor named Rena Quint. Uh, ah, okay, lovely. In the center, there's that's a book that a German journalist wrote about her. She met her once and decided to follow her, through her activity during the day. She, followed. My mother was a psychologist. Okay, we'll talk about that too. But so she wrote a book about her. The upper right picture, she's with President Frank-Walter Steinmeier, who's the president of Germany. She met with him also when he was here. And bottom, this is an IDF march. Um, there she is with the you know officers from the IDF. Okay.
The book in English?
No, it wasn't translated. And this is like an old picture of the family, but this is like half the family. Okay. She had 3 children, 21 grandchildren, and when she died, I think there were 48 great grandchildren. So yeah. Okay, so, and then this is a picture of Host. So now we're going to start. This is the town she came from. I think it's breathtakingly beautiful. Um, um, it's a town in what was then Czechoslovakia, a town of around 20,000 people, a third of whom were Jews. Today, it's part of the Ukraine. Jews were in the middle class. They were shopkeepers, they were businessmen, they were craftsmen. And actually, when we were little and we used to go to the country in the summer, and my mother would, as we would leave the, asphalt of the city and start to see the mountains of the Catskills, and she would say, "Oh, this reminds me of Hust," and we always laughed at her. We didn't take it seriously. And then in 2012, we went on a trip with the whole family, and we saw how beautiful it was. Really one of the most beautiful places I've ever been. Um, so, they went to school and they swam in the river, and all the children went to school till around age 14. I mean, that was it. That's when they finished. And then I guess they helped in the home and then they got married. Um, and they were three daughters, three sisters. My mother was the youngest. They were very well dressed. My grandmother liked fine things, and she would order fabric from wherever to make clothing and curtains. And she upkept a very fine home. My grandfather had two businesses that were under the house. One was a mineral water business. It was mineral water that people bought for health, for medicinal purposes. And he had some kind of um, it was a place where they would sell wine, they would sell alcohol, they would sell tea. And people would come, the people who would frequent that business would be people who came from up in the mountains because they were down below and there were mountains, and people would they would chop down the trees and then they would send the logs down on the river, and then they would pass through the town and they would come there, and it was a good parnasa for them. Um, my grandfather was an unusual combination of being a chassid and a Zionist. He wanted to come to Israel. And when he would meet somebody who had been in Israel, he would like drink up their words to hear what they would say and what they would describe. And he he actually got certificates, which, at the time it was before the state was established and there wasn't open immigration, and you needed a certificate from the British in order to, there was a quota of how many people could come. And he actually got certificates for the family to come to Israel. And my grandmother didn't want to come, so they stayed. Um, Now, had my mother stayed in Hust, had the Holocaust not occurred, she would have stayed there and she would have gotten married and had a very simple life. And there's an irony in the fact that as a result of the unbelievable and unbearable things that they experienced, it opened up a lot of opportunities to her to have a much, much richer life, to be able to spend 35 years living in Israel, having a career, etc. And that's, things we don't really understand, how Hashem makes, you know, turns things around. Okay, in 1939, my mother was 12 years old. She was born in 1927. So in 1939, World War II broke out, but the leader of Hungary, who was a fascist and who was like a partner to Hitler, said to him, "Don't come into Hungary or this region. I'll take care of it." So for 5 years, they lived under Hungarian rule while the rest of Europe was being destroyed completely. But there was this slow process of life unraveling. Um, in 1939, the Hungarians marched in, and there was, how did they announce things? How were things, how were the people told what's going on? Somebody walked around with a drum, and people understood that they should come out to the town square and hear what's going on. And then an announcement was made. The Hungarians are now here. Life is going back to normal. Everybody, life can resume. And my mother would describe how my grandfather would cry. And he knew that, something bad is waiting for us. So they went back to school, because there was this unclear period. So, while the Hungarians came in, there was a period that everybody was at home and they were told to go back to school. So they come back to school and they're sitting in the classroom, and my mother feels somebody throws a little spitball at her, and she opens it up and it says death to the Jews. A kid threw at her. And she said, we didn't, it didn't really move her very much. It didn't scare her. It's something I heard as growing up in New York. I imagine that you've all experienced some kind of anti-Semitism. I would guess. I don't know if you have, but on a day-to-day level, dirty Jew, not not something that necessarily shakes you up. And then the teacher came in and she welcomed everybody back. And this was a school, they didn't go to Jewish schools. It was everybody went to school together. And there were several different kinds of populations. And the teacher says, where were the Jewish kids? Oh, you stand up. There's the door. They were thrown out of school. That was their last day of school. She was 12 years old and they couldn't go to school anymore. And then the business licenses started to be taken away. So there was no parnassa. Okay, so my grandfather, who had this mineral water business, still had a few bottles, and he would kind of try to sell them, even though his business wasn't officially open. Somebody came in to his other business and said, they sent me here from the city. I'd like to stay here. And my grandfather understood that he was taking over his business, and he took over the business, and my grandfather left. And one day he's walking in the street carrying the mineral water bottles to try to bring them to someone who had ordered them. And the police stopped him and they said, what are you doing? And they arrested him and they took him to jail. And they had him there for 3 days for trying to sell mineral water to bring a little bit of bread to the table of his family. And he came home and his hands and his feet were all swollen. They had beat him for trying to sell some mineral water, to try to have a little bit of parnassa. And he cried and cried and cried. What my grandmother did in order to try to bring in some livelihood, because of the beautiful place that they lived, people came there on vacation. There were the rivers, and so there were a few hotels in town. And she went to the hotel owners and she said, if you have overflow, send them to us. If you have, so the house became a rooming house. So they took they had 2, 3 bedrooms, and the girls had to find a little corner. They would hang a little curtain somewhere to sleep because they would now use the bedrooms to rent out to people. And it was embarrassing. There was a Chobadika family, and they didn't tell people. They were ashamed. And but that's what they did. Probably in every other house, things were going on that people were ashamed of because everybody had their way to try to continue to have livelihood during these difficult times. At one point, men were rounded up and taken to the local forest for a few days, and everybody was so worried. And then they came back and they hadn't done anything. It's not that they took them to do some labor or something. It was just to kind of create, to break the security and of your daily routine. Kind of life unravels. And what was once safe and secure is now full of uncertainty. At some point, my grandfather sent my 2 older aunts to Budapest to try to learn a trade and to work on the black market. Also to try, there was a lot of attempt to black market. They would buy sugar or wheat and send it down, and or actually the sugar and the flour were sent up to them, the agricultural products from Hus to Budapest, which they would try to sell. And they would send textiles, which they would try to sell in Hust. Okay. And they were there. My two aunts, Etu and Alti, were there. And in March 1944, on Erev Pesach, there was a Nazi invasion of Hungary and Czechoslovakia. And my grandparents notified my aunts that they should hurry home. And they went to the train station to try to see when there were trains that will take them back to Khust. And then over there, my older aunt was rounded up and she was taken away. And they didn't know what happened to her. And they didn't see her until after the war ended. And my younger aunt, the younger sister Alti, came home. And this is Erev Pesach. And they're beside themselves. And there's no people on the street. And it's Erev Pesach, and my grandfather goes to shul, and he doesn't come home, and they're worried about him. And my grandmother tells my mother, go out and look for him. And she's out in the street and she's looking, and the streets are empty and there's nobody there. And she goes to the shul to see if he's there, and there's nobody in the shul. And she comes back, and then she sees somebody walking down the street, and he looks familiar, but she doesn't know who it is. He's wearing a little cap and he's clean shaven. And it was my grandfather. She had never seen him without his beard and without his hat. And he was afraid that they would, cut off, pull out the hairs of his beard. So he went and he changed his appearance, and he comes home. And then my aunt Alti arrives, and my grandfather runs out to her and kisses her feet. And they have a Seder night where they're just crying and crying. And after Pesach, right after Pesach, they're told to get organized, and they created a ghetto for them. In other words, the idea was just to round up the people from the town and to put them in one place. They took two streets where a lot of Jews lived, and everybody had to come there. So they're packing and, trying to see, should they hide things? Should they not hide things? Their valuables, because they couldn't take everything. My grandfather said, if we live, we live, and we don't need the money, the things, we'll have our life. And if we die, who cares if we hide these things? But they hid some things anyway, and they went to this ghetto, and they were living, a few families in one apartment. And during the time they were there for 5 weeks, and during the time they were in the ghetto, the women were cooking all the time. They knew they were going somewhere. They didn't know where they were going. They knew they were going to go on a train, and they thought they were going someplace where they would have to work and they would need food. So they created pastas and crackers and all kinds of dry foods that they could take with them and that will last for a long time. My aunt Alti was in the ghetto, went out. It wasn't a ghetto like some of the Polish ghettos that are completely sealed and guarded around them. They were able to come and go. So my aunt and a friend of hers went out to see what was going on at the house. And she came back in hysterics because she saw like there was a horse and buggy and there were people in the house and they were emptying everything. They were just taking all their things. And she saw a girl on the street who was wearing a dress that was made from the curtains from their house. The Jews weren't even gone yet. And they were already taking all their things. These people who lived near them for generations, and they're just, no one ever said, we're sorry for what you're going through. Nothing. So there was also a story in the ghetto that they heard that there was a little girl who didn't stop crying. She was crying and crying. And she, a little girl, maybe 2, 3 years old. And the story was that this girl's parents were well-to-do, and they had an au pair who lived with them, but who was from the town. And they wanted to run away, and they were able to run away, but they couldn't take the girl with them because they knew that they can't go with her. You can't take a child when you're trying to hide and try to be quiet. And they asked this woman who was so devoted to them, they paid her a lot of money and they said, you keep the child and we'll come back, after everything blows over and we'll take her. And they did that and they paid her a lot of money and they left. And then she decided she didn't want to do this anymore. She was afraid, I guess. So she took the child and brought her to the ghetto and left her there. And this little girl who has nobody, no parents, nobody she knows. And she was crying and crying. They took them from the ghetto to a brick factory where they stayed and waited for the train. And then right before Shavuos, they were already in Auschwitz. Okay. Um, there was also one more story about my grandfather. Um, when they were packing, my grandfather was I said that my grandmother loved fine things and she liked to keep, um, a very respectable home. And my grandfather was a man of the book and he wanted a simple life. And like I said, he wanted to go to Israel, and work the soil. And when they were emptying out the house and they were trying to figure out what to take, um, he he needed to take my Aunt Etu, the one who was rounded up before. He said, maybe we'll meet her. And he found these snakeskin shoes that she had. And he needed to give her snakeskin shoes. And when they were at the at the train station, suddenly he was looking in his bag and he's looking and he's emptying everything and he can't find one of the shoes and he was so worried. And you think of this contrast, like what people are feeling and they're in this untenable situation. And he's just thinking, what can I do that when I meet my daughter, I can make her happy? I want to bring her shoes. So the trip to Auschwitz was around 3 days. I don't know if you've heard or read or seen films or stories about, the train, there's it's cattle cars and there's windows up above with barbed wire and there's two pails in the middle of that caboose. One with water and one empty, and that's the bathroom. Okay, no privacy. Water is splattering, everything is splattering, everybody, the odor is unpleasant. Families are huddled together. It's very quiet. And my mother, who was a very, very social being, says she has no idea who was with them in their car on the train because she just remembers the family huddling together. And my grandfather telling them, always volunteer to work because if you work and you're productive, then you'll survive. And she describes the flashing lights, because there's just shadows and lights coming in. And she says that as an adult, years later, when we would be traveling at night in the car and the light of the headlights, oncoming headlights, always gave her anxiety. She didn't know why. It took her a long time to realize, where it came from. Um, So now all the Hungarian Jews, the nearly a 500,000, arrived within 6 weeks to Auschwitz, and 90% of them went straight to the gas chambers. Okay. So they're arriving, and it's a big, big hullabaloo. Okay, there's, the doors are flung open and there are Jewish prisoners with striped uniforms who are telling them, hurry up, get off the train. You can leave your things. Don't you see the smoke over there? You won't need your things when you go there, and they didn't know what was going on. They didn't know what this was. And there's people, to the right, to the left, there are lines forming and suddenly it's all very orderly and you see there's a row of young women and there's a row of men who are a little bit older. In other words, the women who were selected for potential work. That the idea was that there was a like two needs that the Nazis had, or two goals that they had in rounding up all the Jews. First of all, they wanted to kill all the Jews, but on the other hand, for the war effort, they needed labor. So people who could work, they wanted to keep them so that they can work. And that's what these labor camps were. They were places where they were part of the war effort. They needed to do, if it's to create, to produce spare parts that are needed for the war, or ammunitions and things like that. So the men who were strong enough were probably 20s, 30s, were on one line, and the young women on another line. And then you see the grandmothers and the children or young mothers. And my mother saw Mrs. Shiner, who was their next door neighbor, with her daughter Florine and her two little children who my mother used to babysit for. And they're walking off toward the gas chambers. She didn't know where they were going, but it was clear that they were not going. She convinced herself that maybe they're going to a place for weaker people, but they were actually just all going off to their death. So from there, they were taken to be disinfected. They were given a dress. In other words, there were the clothing that in the suitcases that people brought. And what had happened in the camp was they would have a pile of dresses, and if that had arrived, and every new prisoner got a dress, but you didn't get to try it on to see if it fit you, and so my mother got a dress that was very, very long, and she cut off strips from the bottom to give to the women for kisoi rosh, to cover their hair. Um, there was another woman who, there was a woman who was a hunchback, and she was given a blue dress with big yellow polka dots. And one of my mother's friends, actually the daughter of this, one of the daughters of this Mrs. Shiner I had mentioned, her name was Bailu, and Bailu was very pretty. And Bailu says to this woman in the hunchback, she says, "I want to trade dresses with you," because she knew that that dress attracts so much attention, and they'll see this woman with the hunchback. This is a woman who needs to fade in, in the background. And after the war, Vida was somewhere, and a woman came over to her and she said, "You don't know who I am, but you saved my life." Because this was the woman who was given that dress, and Vida switched dresses with her so that she could have something more subtle. So you see, there was this solidarity. You see a sense of solidarity that Vida didn't have to do that. You're in this horrible place. And that was just her instinct to reach out to save another person. So when they went from the trains to that bathhouse, one of the things that, again, this irony, the road they were walking on was littered with watches and diamonds and cash and jewels, because people knew that if they tried to hide things on their body, in their pockets, and they knew that if they're caught, they're going to get beaten. So they just emptied their pockets, and, they said, "We don't need this anyway." So imagine a place that's like a killing machine and accessible to everybody, l'chora, are just all the valuables in the world, and they have no value at all. So life in Auschwitz, they didn't work when they were there. So as I said, they arrived before Shavuos, and they were there, my mother and my aunt Alti, and my grandmother were there together for around 5 months. Okay. And there was roll call twice a day. And roll call was around 4 hours long. And they lived in these barracks that were like 100 yards long. Okay, which is very long. There were like 1,800 people in a barrack. Um, and they slept on, there were these, you've probably seen pictures, 3 levels of wooden bunk beds, without mattresses, of course, just a wooden slat, and 12 women on each one of those slats. So they slept, they had to be like, like this, and when it was time to turn over, everyone needed to turn over at once. There was very little food. They got their piece of bread twice a day with some kind of watery soup that was, my grandmother couldn't eat it. They mamash held her down and force fed her because she couldn't eat. And all the time they were worried about my grandmother. My grandmother was in her mid-40s. She wasn't a healthy person, l'chatchila. And women that age didn't really, there weren't very many women there that age. And all the time they were, every time there was, they would have these selections. They would come and they would do a selection. They would always, they were kind of in hours that weren't roll call. Um, they were kind of free to do whatever they wanted, but it's not, it, it was always a very stressful and difficult time. But they would go and see who's in the next barrack. Who do we know here? Who will we see from Hus? Because people looked for people that they knew to hold on to their past, to have something that could warm their hearts. And there was a woman a young girl that they found one day who had been a classmate of one of my aunts. Her name was Suri Weiss, and my mother remembered her with her pink cheeks and her beautiful braids. And everyone there had to have, they call it, I think, a Lagerschwester. Lager means camp. And a Lagerschwester is like a sister, a camp sister. My mother had my aunt, and she had my grandmother. But people that were alone needed to have somebody, kind of a partner, So they tried to adopt this Suri Weiss because she was alone. And she was just always saying, I have no core, I have no strength. And they would, like, during the roll call, they would hold her up. She would sit down, they would hold her up when they were counted and when they were being inspected. And she just, one day she died, from people who didn't have and people lost their will to live. Some people were strong enough and some people didn't have that strength. So, one of the first days after the roll call, they went to the latrines. The latrines were like the bathrooms. So it was another barrack. It was like a barrack, but instead of those beds on the side, they would have a long, 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 long row of like concrete with holes in it. Okay. And, one next to the other, next to the other. And those were the toilets. So, like, hundreds or people could go in at once sitting next to one another, like no privacy, no shame, and they got used to it. And there were also like 2 faucets or whatever where they could go have something to drink. And there are 30,000 people at this roll call because there's 30 barracks and they all come out and everybody's running to get something to drink. And my mother is standing there online and she sees also a prisoner, but somebody whose job was to be the assistant of one of the more senior people, and she has 2 pails. She went to fill up water, I guess, for the person who she worked for. In other words, she was allowed to bring water. And as she passed, my mother mumbles kind of to herself, "Could I have a drink?" She didn't even expect her to hear, and even if she would hear, she wouldn't be able to stop. I mean, and she kept going. And then she sees that she came back. And she says, go ahead. She reached down. She was able to drink a little water. And it gave her, like, it restored her faith in humanity. That this woman, they could have attacked her. Everybody could have just jumped on her and taken all the water suddenly. But she heard somebody reaching out for him. And she was, she came to her. I want to tell you a story about Yom Kippur in the Bier. As we said, right? It was Erev Shavuot, and now it's already Yom Kippur. Now, the barracks the camp was a women's camp. The men's camp was somewhere else. But there were men prisoners who would come into the women's camp to fix things, okay, when things needed to be taken care of. So the men would come. So that was a way of communication. It was kind of this kind of undercover way of communication, and you heard things from the other camp, and messages were sent back and forth. And one day, one of the prisoners says, there was a man here this morning, and he gave me a machzer. And he said, tonight it's Kol Nidre night, and I'm going to read Kol Nidre in the barrack. So there was in the barrack, beside these the long rows of beds, there was kind of a little wall in the middle, a brick wall. It was really like there was an oven, like a heater at the far end, like a chimney, with a chimney, and then the heat could come through like a pipe that was in this wall, but they never heated. So they would stand on it when somebody would want to speak or give instructions or something. So here, this young woman who had the machzer stood up on the wall, and she started reading the Kol Nidre, and 1,800 women start bawling, and some of them were religious and some of them weren't religious. Some of them knew what the Kol Nidre was, some of them didn't know, but they were just all sobbing. It was just this opportunity for unloading some of that heavy pain they were feeling. A few years ago, I read a story of a woman whose name is Judy Weissenberg, who was a Holocaust survivor living in Toronto, and she told exactly the same story. So we got confirmation that it happened like that, because she told exactly the same story. So she must have been one of the women in the barrack also. My mother went over to the woman who had the machzer, and she asked if she could look through it because she wanted to find something that she can learn by heart, something short that she could take with her, that she could say when she feels that she needs strength. And she looked through the Avinu Malkeinu prayers. I don't know if you guys know Avinu Malkeinu. Some of you. Um, we say it on Yom Kippur, and it's just a list of all kinds of things we're asking Hashem for. And she chose Avinu Malkeinu, Tehei Hasha'a Hazot, Shat Rachamim Ve'et Ratzon Milfanecha. Let this be our Father, our King. Let this be a moment of mercy before you. Do you know this song? Tehei Hasha'a Hazot. Could we sing it? Tehei.
I don't know if everybody knows it.
If anybody knows it? If some of you do?
Yeah.
Tehei Hasha'a Hazot, Shat Rachamim Ve'et Ratzon Milfanecha. Tehei Hashalom, Shat Rachamim Ve'et Ratzon מלפניך תהי שעת So this became like a mantra. And when they were traveling and when they were worried, my aunt would always say and the other cousins and the friends, they would say to my mother, Gitu, zog doch etwas. Say something. And she would say, Avinu Malkeinu, te'eh shazot jajach mimet ratzon fenecha. Avinu Malkeinu, te'eh shazot jajach mimet ratzon fenecha. And it was something that she took with her. So right after Yom Kippur, there was a big selection in the barrack. And usually when there were selections, they tried to kind of sneak out. They saw that people were coming, so they would go into another barrack because they were allowed to. It wasn't that they were necessarily closed off in their barrack. But here they couldn't get away. And what they were told to do, they needed to undress, put their dresses on their arm. All of them, I told you there's that wall. So they all had to be on one side of the wall. And then there were the SS who were there to inspect them, and they had to pass by one at a time in front of the SS. So they kind of portioned the barrack into, I guess, the area of the people who were not yet inspected, the people who were inspected and passed the inspection, and then there were two little rooms at the entrance to the barrack. One of them was the room of the block Eltesta, which is the woman in charge of that block of the barrack, and the other room was called the bread room. I guess that's where they organized the bread and the food. And anyone who was selected out was taken into one of those two rooms. But there was a lot of hullabaloo, and everybody was worried, and there was, when it was crowded, and they were crying and screaming, and so they went around, and then my mother, and they lost each other. They were next to each other, but because of the whole balagan, they didn't see each other. And then after my mother passed the inspection, my aunt passed the inspection, they found each other, but they didn't see my grandmother. Where is Anyuka? Where is Anyuka? They can't find her. And then when they finished this inspection, what the SS did was they kind of created a human chain with their few people, and then they opened the two doors of those little rooms to take all those people out so that they can't mix back with this group. In other words, it was done in a very clean way so that they take them all out. And they could see who's going out, and they don't see my grandmother there either. So she's not here and she's not there. Where is she? And then the SS leave and they take all those people away. And then the door to one of those little rooms opens up. And my grandmother comes out, white as a ghost. And she falls on them crying, I'm alive, I'm alive, I'm alive. There was a bed in that little room, and there was a little cabinet, a little closet. And she said to a cousin who was there, she said, come, let's hide, because they were in this room alone till the SS came to take them out. And this cousin said, no, they'll just beat us. So my grandmother went alone. She moved, the cabinet was on a corner, so she was able to hide behind. And when they came in and they took all the people out, they didn't bother looking. They didn't look under the beds. There may have been some people hiding under the beds, and there was someone, and my grandmother survived. And after this happened, they realized that they need to get out of there. Now, what does it mean to get out of Auschwitz? Is the 1 o'clock a tight limit?
As close to one as you can. Like you say, it's fine. There's nothing else afterwards. You know what I mean?
Okay. So do you want me to finish up or okay.
Keep going as long as you want.
If you want me to go on, I could go on. If you want, I could shorten it. So what?
I don't know about anyone else.
Okay. Okay. So what was happening is, as I said, they needed labor, right? The Nazis needed labor, and they weren't doing, the only people who worked in Auschwitz were the people who were working in Auschwitz. In other words, the people who took them off the trains, the people who sorted the clothing, the people who took the bodies out of the the gas chambers, but the war effort was in other places. So every once in a while, they would call for people they would round up people to send them to a labor camp. And they realized that they have to go on a transport, they called it, to a labor camp, so that at least they would work and they're in less immediate danger. And my grandmother is in less immediate danger. And I just want to say, I don't know if you're familiar with Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning. And, I always wondered, like, why when my mother would tell her story, she would spend 90% of the time talking about my grandmother. And I always said, like, it's your story. It's not her story, and then I understood that that's what gave them purpose. That's what their meaning was, to help her survive. And that's what kept them going. Um, so, um, so they asked for 200 women, and they rounded up the 200 women, and they took them first to the showers to go to a labor camp, including my grandmother, including another aunt of my mother's, somebody who was in my grandmother's generation. And then at the last minute, they told them that they can't, they took them out. So my aunt and my mother couldn't say, oh, never mind, we want to stay here with our mother, and they assumed that they took her straight to the gas chambers, and they left. And then they ended up, so this was um, right after Sukkot, okay, right after Shmini Atzeret. And they didn't even have a chance to say goodbye to my grandmother because they just pulled her out, and then they got on the train, and you assumed that they would never see her again. And they ended up, I'm gonna shorten the part about the labor camp, but I'll just summarize it, that it was unbearably cold, and they would work 12 hours a day on these machines. And they said, like, my grandmother never would have survived it. They thought that would be the place that she could be saved, but she never would have survived it. And so again, the part about the labor camp I'll skip, but I'll just tell one more thing, that the day after they left, a group of men, this was a story. Okay, one second. No, I'll tell it in a different order. Okay, I'm going to now talk about the liberation. Okay, one day they hear they're called, they're in the camp. It's a Sunday, and Sundays they didn't go to work, but the SS are calling them, so they come and they line up, and they tell them, you don't need to line up. The war today is May 8th, 1945. The war is over. You can go wherever you want. You can do whatever you want. We were asked to stay here and watch over you for safekeeping until the Russian army arrives. So we ask that you do no harm to us. And these women, there are around 200 women. It was a small camp. And they're standing there like this. They're not jumping for joy. They're not ecstatic. They're just standing there like this. Until now, their biggest worry was, when am I getting my next piece of bread? And now you can go wherever you want. Where could we want to go? Back to Hust, where our neighbors of all those years were happy to see us go? Do we have a family? Do we have anything? Do whatever you want. What could we do? We've just been prisoners. We weigh, whatever, 30 kilo. We probably can't have children. We have no education. What could we possibly do? At that moment of, like, the greatest despair the greatest hopelessness. If we could only tell them, if we could only have told them at that moment what an amazing life they were going to build for themselves. They were going to go off and they would get married and they would have children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren and they would study and they would have a career and they would have joy, because that's what they did afterwards. After all they went through, they created a life because life is so strong that it gave them the ability to overcome all that adversity. I want you to just hear my mother speak a little bit, okay? So I'm going to play something for you. It's a story that I told you. So first of all, after they started heading home, oh,
We're getting there.
we're getting there. Okay, it doesn't matter. It took them around 6 weeks to get back home. And on the way, they walked most of the way. You know, it was like, you know, those snow globes that you buy, you know, as souvenirs, like that you shake them, all that snow, and you see the Washington Monument or whatever, you know, those that's what Europe was like. You know, people were walking and going home and they were in torn clothes and hungry, and everybody, did you see so and so? You know, people are trying to find each other, and you know, whole towns were decimated, and they were on the last leg to Hus, and a train stopped, like it was a few miles from Hus, and they went. My mother got off the train to see there was a train coming from the other direction, so she went to see.
We never know when a Jewish holiday will start. We never know. Every morning, a group of men arrived in our camp. They were Jewish men with striped uniforms. They came to fix things. And we go back to our barrack because we get our soup somewhere around 1 o'clock. I don't know, no time, of course. And we were going back into our barracks. And I go back and I remember there is a young girl, maybe as old as I, or maybe a year older or a year younger, I don't know. And she said, "Look what I got from the men. They gave me a machzor of Yom Kippur. And they said, tonight is Yom Kippur." We didn't know that. We were working. And she said, "I'm going to read it to you." And so she stood, there was a little wall in the center of the barrack. She stood on it so that she can see the people who are up on top. And she starts reading it. And 1,200 women begin crying. It was horrible to listen.
I already told you. You just get a little bit of a sense. I mean, this is a beautiful film actually that they made at Yad Vashem, and you should watch the whole thing if you want. Look up her name, Giselle Cycowicz. I think you'll see it in the announcement, right? And at Yad Vashem. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that she appears in. So read it, or you could review. So they're on the rail at a railway station, heading back to Khust, and there's a train that's coming from Khust. So my mother gets off her train because they knew they were waiting there for a few hours to look into the train that's coming back from Khust to see if there's anyone that they know. And there's a man there, and he recognized her, and she recognized him, and he says to her, "Your mother is at home." And they were sure their mother died. They were sure their father would be at home, and their mother wouldn't. but it was the other way around. And she ran to tell my aunt, and they went home. And together with my grandmother, who they reunited with, they made their way. It took a few years, another 3 years till they got out of Europe. They made their way to America. And it took time till they were able to rebuild their lives, but they rebuilt their lives. And another thing I wanted to share, the question, what happened to my grandfather? They never really knew what happened exactly to my grandfather. My mother and, they knew he didn't come home, but they didn't talk about him. They knew he didn't come home. And then sometime later, they were like, when they were going through Europe, I mean, they were like kind of wandering from place to place in Europe till they were able to get to a place from which they were able to get to America. And they were sitting in some, I guess, rooming house or wherever they were living. And my grandmother tells them this story that right after they left, right after they left to the labor camp, a group of men, Huster men, arrived at Auschwitz back from out. They had been in the coal mines or something, and they came back, and somebody came to the fence and asked one of the women on the, it was in the men's camp, and there were the women in the women's camp, and asked if there were any women from Hust still there, and they said yes. And he said, "My name is Wolf Friedman. Tell my wife and tell the others, 200 men from Hust just arrived, and we won't be here tomorrow any longer." Okay. In other words, they had worked in the coal mines for a few months. When they were wrung dry, they brought them back to kill them. And they knew that it was right after Simchas Torah, so they know his yahrzeit. And my grandmother, months after they came back, told them that story. And my mother tells the story, and she says, "But we didn't cry." She told us the story, we heard it. We didn't cry. Why didn't we cry? And she always tried to understand why. And she said, usually the Jewish custom is when a Jew dies, there's one deceased, there's 1, 2, 5, 10 Avelim, mourners, and then the community comes to give condolences. Okay? And here, there was nobody to give, we're all mourners. And there's nobody to give condolences to, who could give us condolences. And this reminded me of a chapter in Sefer Yechezkel, okay, in the Navi. I have a translation of it, but I'm going to tell you what it says. Okay, Yechezkel was a Navi who prophesied prior to the Churban. Okay, today's Shavas B'Tammuz. We're commemorating the beginning of the middle, right? We're leading up to the Churban. Okay, and it's like this. The word of Hashem came to me saying, Ben Adam, son of man, that's what Hashem called Yechezkel. I am about to take away from thee the delight of your eyes at once. Okay, he's going to take away his wife. He was like a mashal, like an allegory, a live allegory, all kinds of things that happened to him that are symbolic, that Hashem is talking about, is showing this is what's going to happen to the Jewish people. So he says, I'm going to take away the delight of your eye at a stroke, and you shall not mourn nor weep, nor shall tears run down. Sigh in silence. Make no mourning for the dead. Wear your turban, put on your shoes. Do not cover your lips, and do not eat the bread of men. These are all different customs of avelut, of mourning. Okay, that Hashem is telling him, don't carry out those minhagim. Act regular. So I spoke to the people in the morning, and in the evening, my wife died. And I did in the morning as I was commanded. And the people said to me, will you not tell us what these things mean to us that you are doing They understood it's a mashal. They understood it's an allegory. Then I answered them, the word of Hashem has come to me saying, speak to the house of Yisrael. Ko amar Hashem, this is what Hashem says. Behold, I will profane my sanctuary, my Beis HaMikdash, the pride of your strength, the delight of your eyes, and the longing of your soul. And your sons and your daughters, whom you have left behind, shall fall by the sword. And you shall do as I have done. You shall not cover your lips, nor eat the bread of men, and your turbans shall remain on your heads, and your shoes upon your feet, and you shall not mourn nor weep. But you shall pine away for your iniquities, and groan to one another. And thus Yechezkel shall be a sign for you, according to all that he has done shall you do. And when this comes about, you shall know that I am Hashem. Via Barbanel, one of the Mefarshim, explains, you shall neither mourn nor weep, not over the burning of the Beis HaMikdash, and not due to your sons and daughters who are killed, because there is no mourning unless there are comforters. And since you will all be mourning, who will comfort whom? Exactly as my mother said it. She didn't know this parak in Yechezkel. So I'm going to end my talk now. I don't want to end it on a down note. I think that one thing that my mother was a person who was so full of hope and life and positivity. And I think that the message from her story is we have to remember who we are, and we have to worry about ourselves and each other. And with our own solidarity and our own strength, we will overcome every adversity.